There is a moment in almost every interview where the room decides whether you are self-aware or whether you are performing. And it happens on one question. You know which one. The scary part is not that this question is a trick. It is real and it is scored, but not in the way you think. Nobody writes down your weakness. They write down something else, something that follows you further than the interview does. The wrong kind of honest answer can hurt you more than a fake one could, and I am about to show you what gets recorded. I'm Dre, and I've been on the recruiting side long enough to know that what candidates see and what companies see are not the same thing. If that idea makes you a little uncomfortable, good. Stay with me, because that discomfort is exactly where most people lose this question without ever knowing why. And if this is the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe now, because we go behind the curtain like this a lot. Here's the thing. Almost every candidate treats the weakness question like it's about the weakness. It isn't. Functionally, it never was. What's actually happening is that an interviewer is quietly filling in a box on a scorecard, and that box usually isn't labeled weakness. In systems I've worked with, it's labeled something closer to self-awareness or coachability. The interviewer isn't cataloging your flaws. They're testing whether you can look at yourself honestly and still function. That's the real signal. And here's what people miss. Two candidates can name the exact same weakness in the exact same interview loop and walk away with completely different notes. One gets flagged low self-awareness. The other gets flagged strong growth signal. Same flaw, different outcome. That should tell you something. You've been optimizing the wrong target this whole time. And that scorecard box follows you further than you think. To be clear, most companies don't call it a scorecard box in casual conversation, but structurally, that's close to what it is. A structured interview usually breaks a role down into specific competencies, things like communication, ownership, self-awareness, sometimes trainability, and each interviewer rates you against a few of them independently before anyone compares notes. Nobody in that room is thinking about your weakness as a confession. They're thinking about which box on that sheet just got a little more evidence behind it. That's the part that feels almost too ordinary to be true, and that's exactly why most candidates never think to prepare for it. The mechanism isn't dramatic, it's a form. But a boring form still decides real outcomes. Now, here's where people usually go wrong trying to fix it. They think the safe move is the classic answer. I work too hard. I care too much. I'm a perfectionist. I understand why it feels safe. It doesn't expose anything real. But I want to be careful here, because this is where people misunderstand it. Interviewers have heard that answer hundreds of times. It doesn't read as safe to them. It reads as evasive. Behind the scenes, that's often when I've seen a hiring manager quietly write something like genuine next to the note with a question mark, because the confidence in that scorecard box just dropped. Nothing dramatic happens in the room. No one says it out loud. The candidate finishes the interview thinking it went fine. And it did feel fine. That's the part applicants don't realize. A fine interview and a strong interview are not the same thing, and the gap between them is invisible from the candidate's side. So maybe you think the fix is just to be more honest. Pick a real flaw and say it plainly. Here's where it gets more uncomfortable, because honesty alone isn't protection either. If the role is deadline heavy and you say you struggle with time management, that's not humility to the panel. That's a risk flag sitting directly on top of the job description. I've personally seen versions of this where a candidate loses points not because they lied, but because they accidentally disqualified themselves with the truth. So now the trap tightens. Canned answers read as fake. Honest answers can read as disqualifying. What's actually left? Here's where the conspiracy version of this falls apart, and where the boring version turns out to be worse. There's no secret committee deciding your fate over one answer, and no single word that quietly ends your candidacy. Most interviews where you give an okay answer here still move forward completely fine, because one weak moment rarely sinks an otherwise strong loop. I want to be careful here, because panic isn't useful. What actually matters isn't a single answer. It's a pattern across the whole conversation, whether your self-awareness shows up once or shows up consistently. The boring truth is that nobody is out to get you in that room. They're just quietly collecting evidence, interview after interview, and evidence adds up whether you notice it happening or not. This is the part that took me a while to explain clearly, because it's not really about which weakness you pick. It's about the shape of the answer. In systems I've worked with, interviewers are quietly pattern matching for a specific structure, even if they couldn't tell you that out loud. Name the weakness, show the system or process you built to manage it, show a real result. That three-part shape is what reads as coachable, whether or not anyone in the room could explain why. The same flaw, told with a fix and a result, moves a scorecard note from neutral to positive without changing the actual weakness at all. That should be a relief, honestly, because it means this is learnable. It's not a personality test you either pass or fail. But here's where it gets used against you or for you later. And that part matters more than people expect. Your answer doesn't disappear when the call ends. That's the part nobody tells candidates. Interviewer notes often get quoted almost word for word in the hiring manager debrief, the conversation where the panel compares finalists before anyone gets an offer. If two candidates are close, and they usually are, a strong self-awareness note can become the deciding line in that room. I've heard versions of, "She named this and gave a fix," used to push a borderline candidate over the edge into an offer. That's not a hypothetical. That's a pattern I've watched happen more than once. Your weakness answer isn't just a moment. It's a quote waiting to be used in a conversation you'll never sit in on. And consistency is quietly being checked in that same conversation too. This is the part people miss completely. Panels aren't just scoring the weakness question by itself. They're informally comparing it against everything else: your resume gaps, your other answers, even the tone of your references. If you say you struggle with delegation, but every story you tell involves you refusing to let go of control, that contradiction gets noticed, even if nobody says it out loud in the room. It doesn't get flagged as lying. It gets flagged as inconsistent, and inconsistent is its own kind of damage. Functionally, it works the same way, even if nobody calls it that. So authenticity here isn't just a moral nice to have, it's functionally protective. It's the thing that keeps your whole story holding together under a light that's watching more closely than you assume. This does not prove anything on its own, and one interview going sideways doesn't mean any of this happened to you specifically. But there are patterns worth noticing. If you consistently get past the first conversation and then quietly stop hearing back right after the behavioral round, that's worth paying attention to, not as proof, just as a signal. If interviewers seem to nod along during your weakness answer and then the energy in the room noticeably shifts, that's usually not your imagination. I can't tell you exactly what happened in a room I wasn't in, but I can tell you that candidates rarely imagine that particular shift. So here's where the conspiracy version of this falls apart, and the boring truth ends up being more useful. There isn't a secret perfect weakness sitting out there waiting to be discovered. Vague weaknesses don't play it safe. They read as unprepared, sometimes even as dishonest by omission. What actually works, in the systems I've seen, is specific. A real weakness with real but survivable stakes, paired with a visible fix. That's what interviewers subconsciously trust, because it feels like something a person actually lived through instead of something they rehearsed in a mirror. I'm not saying this is fair. I'm saying this is how it gets read on the other side of the table. I want to be honest about something else, too, because I know there's a double standard here, and I'm not going to pretend there isn't. Companies ask candidates to be vulnerable in an interview, and then companies themselves ghost candidates, cancel interviews last minute, and leave people waiting for weeks without an update. That double standard is real, and I'm not defending it. But I'm telling you how the hiring side actually reads your answer, not how fair the whole process is, because those are two different conversations, and only one of them is something you can actually control right now, no matter how frustrating the other one is. Now, I can't speak for every company. There are exceptions to almost everything I've just said. Some panels are lazy. Some interviewers don't even read their own notes closely. Some hiring managers make decisions off gut feeling regardless of the scorecard in front of them. This does not prove anything about your specific situation, and one interview going a certain way doesn't mean the system worked exactly the way I described it. But the pattern holds often enough in enough companies I've either worked inside or watched closely that I think it's worth knowing before you walk into the room again. Here's the part that should actually calm you down a little. This isn't about finding a magic sentence that tricks a panel into liking you. It's not a trapdoor, and it's not a formula you memorize word for word and recite. It's closer to a habit of thinking honestly about yourself before someone asks you to. If you've walked out of interviews before feeling like you either faked it or overshared, that's not a personal failure. That's most candidates, because nobody ever explained what the room was actually listening for. Now you know the shape of it. Name something real. Show what you built to manage it. Show what changed because of it. That's it. That's the whole functional mechanism underneath the question that's been intimidating people for decades. If you want to actually build one of these before your next interview, do it before you're in the room, not during. Pick something real, not devastating. Something that's genuinely cost you a missed deadline or a rough conversation with the manager at some point. Then write down, plainly, what you changed after that happened. A process, a habit, a tool, something concrete enough that you could explain it to a stranger in 2 sentences. Then find the smaller moment where it actually worked, a version of the same problem that you handled better the second time around. That's the whole exercise. It takes 15 minutes, and it holds up under follow-up questions, which is exactly where the fake versions usually fall apart. None of this means the question is fair. Most people are never told any of these rules, and that's a real problem with how hiring works, not a flaw in you for not knowing them. But unfair and decodable aren't the same thing. Once you understand that this question isn't measuring your flaws, it's measuring whether you can be trusted with them, the whole interview stops feeling like a trap and starts feeling like something you can actually walk into on your own terms. It may not be called a scorecard box in every company. It may not even be written down the way I've described it here. But if a specific, honest weakness with a real fix consistently moves you from a maybe to a yes, functionally, that's exactly what's happening whether they name it or not. So the goal was never a perfect weakness. There isn't one. The goal is a believable one, told with enough honesty that it holds up under a light you can't see, and enough structure that it actually works in your favor instead of quietly working against you. Be specific. Be consistent. Let the fix be real, not performed. And remember that every answer you give in that room is doing more work than you can see from your side of the table. If this pulled back a curtain you didn't expect, there's another question doing the same thing to more candidates than this one, quietly ending interviews before people even realize what happened. And I'll walk you through that one next.